3 astronauts blasted off on the last Apollo mission to the moon. Along the way, they looked back and took these pictures of what NASA now calls the blue marble.
Well, I know we're not the first to discover this, but we'd like to confirm from the crew of America that the world is round. Roger, that's a good data point.
Today, 4 decades later, astronauts look down at their planet every day from the International Space Station, a tinker toy dragonfly orbiting the Earth 250 miles up. From here, the Earth is a world among other worlds, all executing a dance choreographed by gravity. The moon do-si-does slowly behind the Earth's limb, squashed flat by the atmosphere. Sunrise comes as a sudden arc of light against black space. Solar panels shift to catch the bounty of energy. In orbit, astronauts are no longer bound by the cycle of day and night. Some orbits might look up at an unsetting sun tracing a wheel in the sky, or look down on the dark shadow of a solar eclipse. By day, the Earth is alive, a single geological organism. You can see it breathe, belching gas from volcanoes, and wrapped by whirling storms of rain and lightning. The oceans are Earth's glory, the source of its color and life as we know it. As the station slips into night, the world's nervous system emerges. The lonely gulfs are lit up by constellations of oil drilling platforms, extracting the fossilized remains of ancient sun-fed life. The station never crosses the poles, but it goes far enough north and south to see the wavering crowns of aurora. Once we looked up at the heavens from Earth. Now we look down and out, an angel's view of a spinning ball under the fixed stars, a waypoint for the wandering comets. In the decades since Apollo, robot spacecraft have visited all the planets except Pluto. In July of 2013, the Cassini spacecraft looked back and snapped a picture. Far beyond the many-hued rings of Saturn was our own blue marble, a pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan called it. And still the only pale dot we know. Yet.
to replicate the different ages of each crater. Based on the lunar orbiter photos, NASA could determine the relative ages using something called superposition. This is the simple principle that younger craters will lie on top of older craters. So, if a meteor hits an existing crater, it will destroy part of the rim and create a fresh circle on top. If we look at this set of craters, it's obvious that the larger crater was made first, and then the smaller ones came later. And so, in order to replicate the different ages, the team in Arizona marked out all 143 craters and split them up into 3 different categories: new, intermediate, and old. They placed precise amounts of dynamite under every crater mark to get the right sizes and blew them in sequence, starting with the oldest craters first and working their way through to the newest ones. The result was incredible. In an instant, this random field in Arizona was transformed into an extremely accurate depiction of the Apollo 11 landing site. But what did NASA do with this place? One of the first problems the astronauts would have to overcome when landing on the moon was figuring out where they actually were. Although NASA had a landing site in mind, the actual spot the astronauts touched down could be anywhere within 5 kilometers of this area. Without knowing exactly where the astronauts had landed, NASA wouldn't be able to guide them to the most interesting craters or track where they had gone. This made NASA ask the question, could astronauts accurately locate their location just by comparing their view from the lunar module to a map of the surface? This is where Cinder Lake came in very handy. A mock-up of the lunar module was placed at a random location in the crater field, and 28 test subjects were each given 30 minutes inside to try to find their location. A large portion of the test subjects were actually geologists. Some were mathematicians, some surveyors, and the rest had a wide range of backgrounds. Even with prior experience, this is a very difficult test. Looking from above, it's much easier to understand the geography of what's around us. But when you're on the surface, it becomes much harder to use the craters and rocks as reference points. On top of that, we don't have the same sense of depth on the moon. Without an atmosphere, distant objects don't have the same haziness as they do on Earth, and so a large rock placed really far away could easily be mistaken for a smaller one that's much closer. Even NASA had no idea what to do, but they were hoping that the test would reveal the quickest technique. Each person was given this real satellite image of the moon and 30 minutes to mark down where they thought they were. If they couldn't locate their exact position after 30 minutes, they would be given progressively smaller maps, shrinking the search zone all the way down to just 1/64th of a kilometer. If after 4 hours they still couldn't identify their location, they would fail the test. The results were pretty interesting. Out of the 28 people, only 6 were able to find their location using the 1-kilometer map. 12 people found it using the second map. 8 people found it with the third map. 1 person got it with the fourth map, and 1 person failed the test. But what was the best method? The test subjects started searching for various things: pairs of craters, larger groups of craters, and lines of craters. You might think that a line of craters would be more noticeable and therefore lead to quicker success, but none of the 28 test subjects found their location using this method. Those that started off with this method eventually switched to a different method. By far, the most successful method was searching for pairs of craters. But why? NASA figured that remembering the shape of 2 craters was much easier than visualizing a much more complex array of craters. The key breakthrough for most of the test subjects was locating this pair of craters here. Despite many failing the first attempt, NASA were confident that with much more training and knowledge of the area, astronauts would be able to locate themselves fairly easily. But when it came time to walk on the surface, they needed to know what to look for. After all, the moon was a place completely untouched by humans, and so astronauts were effectively the eyes and hands for scientists back on Earth. In Cinder Lake, geologists started to train the astronauts on how to identify specific rocks and collect samples. They went through field exercises where they would communicate what they were seeing by radio back to a group of scientists. This is when NASA realized something. It became clear that it was really difficult to know what the astronauts were doing and where they were just with radio, and so they started experimenting with transmitting live video from Cinder Lake. This made it so much easier for NASA and the astronauts to work together, and thanks to this breakthrough, NASA decided to do a live broadcast for every moon mission. All in all, astronauts trained here until the Apollo program ended. Over the course of each mission, astronauts brought back more than 380 kilograms of samples from 6 different areas on the moon. Each sample was stored in a different container that preserved them, allowing scientists to study completely untouched moon samples to this day. All this was possible thanks to this small little field in Arizona. And now, time for the Primal Space giveaway. The winner of the previous giveaway is Ivan. Congratulations! In the next video, we'll be giving away this awesome Apollo framed print. All you have to do is sign up at the link below. Hit the like
with an almost identical shape and color scheme. It was clear that the Soviets had taken a lot of inspiration from America's shuttle. But it wasn't clear how the Soviets managed to copy the design and catch up to the Americans so quickly. The US and the Soviet Union already had a history of intense competition when it came to space. The Soviets took the record. This meeting was like any the first satellite into orbit, and then America managed to beat them to the moon. But they also had periods of healthy cooperation. With the Apollo-Soyuz project in 1975, both nations joined their 2 spacecraft together in orbit, where crews from both sides lived for a week. But it was 1 year before this where the Buran story begins. During a secret meeting at the Kremlin, the head of the Soviet military, Leonid Smirnov, met with Soviet leader Brezhnev to discuss the top priorities for the following year. This meeting was like any other, a simple catch-up to keep the Soviet leader up to date on things. But at the end of the meeting, Smirnov alerted Brezhnev that the Americans were working on a winged space vehicle, which would be a strong threat to the Soviet Union. He believed that whatever they were working on was capable of quickly changing orbit and positioning itself directly over Moscow, possibly full of dangerous weapons. At this point in time, NASA's space shuttle designs were only a few years old, but the general concept had been decided on. Realizing that they were at least a few years behind, Soviet leader Brezhnev decided that something had to be done. He wanted the Soviet Union to build a spacecraft that would be even more capable than the shuttle. So an enormous amount of money was set aside and Project Buran was initiated. The military started reaching out to the OKB, a collection of private institutions which would design and prototype advanced technologies, usually for the military. It was no secret that the Soviet space program was one of the best in the world, with tens of thousands of scientists and engineers. Although the project was officially underway by this point, the Soviets hadn't settled on a design yet. They were looking at one of their discarded projects from the 60s, which featured a reusable spaceplane called the Spiral. After briefly bringing the project back to life, it was quickly canceled again by the military, as they knew it wasn't as advanced as what the Americans were doing. And so the Soviets realized that they needed to know more about the vehicle they were trying to beat. Surprisingly, the shuttle program wasn't classified, so every design and research paper was essentially available to the public. The problem for the Soviets was the sheer amount of data and finding a way to organize it. But this wasn't the first time the Soviets set out to gather technical data. In the 60s, they successfully spied on the British and French Concorde manufacturers to produce their own version of the supersonic jetliner known as the Tu-144. But one of the main advantages in this case of espionage was the recent invention of the Internet. Although it was very basic at the time, NASA was storing many of its critical documents in online databases. And so, in order to obtain these documents and funnel the data back to the Soviet engineers, they called upon the service of the KGB. Overseeing the majority of this espionage project was a spy named Vladimir Vertrov. He began working with the KGB at an early age while living in France and eventually worked his way up to being one of the highest-ranking members. He was the perfect man for the job. The Soviets knew exactly what they needed. They were looking for information regarding the shuttle's airframe, flight computers, materials, and the propulsion system. Back at the Soviet Chamber of Commerce in Moscow, they had their own advanced computer center. With this, the Soviets were able to tap into America's online information services and see the names and numbers of shuttle-related documents. With this information, a KGB agent would simply leave the Soviet embassy in Washington and make their way to the government printing office on North Capitol Street. They would tell the government worker the name and number of the document they needed, pay the printing fee, and then take the documents back to the embassy. At this point, the Soviets probably had a party every time they came back with an important document. But all the important technical information still had to be sent back to the Soviet engineers without the US knowing about it. The first step was getting it out of America. They chose to send the documents electronically to research centers in Vienna and Helsinki, much less suspicious than sending them directly to the Soviet Union. From there, KGB workers would forward the documents to Moscow, where a room full of printers would be working around the clock, constantly producing the goods. For the Soviets, the research on heat shield material was of high importance. But one of the biggest breakthroughs was finding the shuttle's wind tunnel data. This is ultimately why the Soviets completely copied the shuttle's shape, since it allowed them to save billions of dollars on wind tunnel testing. This method of online espionage went on for years, and the Soviets also targeted research projects at various universities all across the US, constantly funneling the data back to the Soviet Union. But eventually,
one simple but brilliant trick to heat your home in 90 seconds and save thousands of dollars on your heating bill this winter. This genius way to heat any room for almost zero cost is taking over the market like crazy in the US. An ingenious college kid from Fairbanks, Alaska, just destroyed the billion-dollar heating industry
agencies realized what was going on. President Reagan quickly stopped the Soviets from being able to purchase research papers from their databases. After realizing how much important data they had already given away, they hatched a plan to sabotage the design of the Soviets' space shuttle. The CIA began creating flawed shuttle design documents and fed them to the Soviets, disguising them as new and improved designs. 2 years after the first space shuttle launch, the extent of Vertrov's spying was finally uncovered. The KGB started to suspect something wasn't right when they found a letter he had sent to his family. In the letter, he bragged about the importance of his job and claimed that he was involved in something really big. But he was doing a lot more than just stealing space shuttle designs. In the early 80s, he began stealing other secret documents and supplying them to the French intelligence service. The French president alerted Ronald Reagan of what was going on, and the Soviets quickly found out that Vertrov was working as a double agent. The KGB brought him back to Moscow and executed him. By the time the American space shuttle first launched in 1981, the KGB had acquired over 3,000 documents relating to the computer systems and wind tunnel tests. Over a series of years, the Soviets spent almost $1 million in today's money, tracking down and obtaining these important documents. There's no doubt that this saved them billions of dollars and years of development. But sadly, the Buran never went on to create history like the space shuttle did. Despite being more capable than the shuttle in many ways, the Buran project was completely abandoned after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The original Buran, which performed the only test flight, was destroyed when the hangar it was in collapsed. The only remaining 2 prototypes are sitting in a hangar in Baikonur. Despite the security surrounding these prototypes, many space fans have made the pilgrimage through the deserts of Kazakhstan to locate and sneak into these hangars. So, although we never got to see it live out its true potential, the Buran will go down in history as one of the most advanced space vehicles of its time.
Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes designed to feed the